Hello, fellow classmates. My name is Vanessa Gutierrez, and this is my Unit 6 presentation on deontological ethics. I decided to go with adultery because it's one of those situations where people are usually very quick to defend themselves morally. Some people. Immanuel Kant doesn't really allow for that. Instead of focusing on excuses or outcomes, he pushes us to ask a tougher question: whether the action itself was morally wrong. And honestly, that's what makes adultery for me a good case to look at, since it naturally brings up everyday issues like honesty, promises, and trust. Now, I just want to be clear about what I mean by adultery in this presentation. In this case, I'm talking about breaking a promise of fidelity within a committed relationship. It usually involves some level of deception and a breach of trust, even if the person tries to keep it hidden. What's interesting to me also is that it's sometimes defended with things like, well, no one got injured, or it didn't really change anything, or even worse, my partner never found out. And that's exactly the kind of reasoning Kant pushes back against. Because for him, morality isn't about how things turn out. It's about whether the action itself followed a moral duty. So before applying Kant to adultery, I just want to cover the basics of how his ethical theory works. For Kant, morality isn't about outcomes or consequences. It's about duty, like whether an action follows a moral rule, regardless of how things turn out. Another idea is that moral rules have to be universal, meaning you don't get special exceptions just because a situation feels personal or complicated. And finally, Kant argues that people must always be treated as ends in themselves, not just as tools or means to get what we want. These three ideas are what guide how Kant evaluates right and wrong, and they're what I'll be using to analyze adultery in the next few slides. This is where Kant's main idea comes in, the categorical imperative. The basic idea is that there's one moral rule that applies to everyone, no matter the situation. Kant explains it using three different tests, but they're really just three different ways of explaining the same action. So I'm going to go through each one right now and show how they apply to committing adultery. The first test Kant gives us is the universal law test. Put simply, he wants us to ask whether the rule behind an action could apply to everyone. There are no special exceptions here, even if someone feels justified. So Kant asks us to imagine what happens if everyone follows the same rule. If that doesn't make sense, or if it creates a contradiction, then the action fails this test. When you take Kant's universal idea and apply it to adultery, it doesn't really hold up. If everyone thought cheating was okay whenever they felt justified, then commitment wouldn't mean much at all. This next test is about how we treat people. Kant says people aren't objects you can use, they have dignity. With adultery, the problem is the deception. By hiding the truth, you're deciding for your partner what they get to know, which means they don't really get a choice. Even if they never find out, you're still using them to keep the relationship comfortable for yourself. And for Kant, that's treating a person as a means, not as an end, which makes the action morally wrong. This is really where respect comes in. Respecting someone as a person means letting them make real choices about their own life and their own relationships. And with adultery, that can't really happen since the partner is being deceived. So if they don't know the truth, then they can't actually consent to staying in the relationship as it really is. Their trust ends up being used to keep things comfortable or stable for the person who's cheating. And from Kant's perspective, that's the problem. The partner is being treated as a means to an end, not as a person whose choices actually matter. The last way Kant looks at morality is what he calls the kingdom of ends. Basically, he asks us to imagine a world where people treat each other as equals and agree to live by the same moral rules. For that kind of world to work, you need trust. When you think about adultery in that context, it doesn't really fit, since a rule that allows deception in relationships would undermine the trust that holds those relationships together. So once that trust starts to fall apart, then the idea of people truly respecting each other as equals starts to fall apart too. So from this perspective as well, adultery doesn't really belong in a moral system that's meant to work for everyone. So this is really where Kant draws the line. For him, right or wrong aren't about how things end up. It's about whether the action itself followed a moral duty. So saying stuff like no one got hurt doesn't really work as a defense because the deception already breaks that duty. Even if nothing seems to go wrong afterwards, the responsibility to be honest and to respect other people as persons is still there. And that's why, from a Kantian point of view, adultery is morally wrong, regardless of how it seems to turn out. So when you put it all together, adultery pretty much fails across the board under Kant's view. It doesn't pass the universal rule test because if everyone did it whenever they felt justified, commitment wouldn't really mean anything. It also fails the idea of treating people as ends because deception takes away your partner's ability to actually choose what they want for their own life. And it doesn't fit with the kingdom of ends either, since that kind of shared moral system depends on trust, and adultery breaks that. So from Kant's perspective, it's not about whether anyone noticed or got hurt. The action itself, cheating, violates moral duty, and that's why it's wrong. Thanks for listening.